stick to the Queen's Gambit. The most classical, the most solid chess opening that was played by pretty much all the world champs, including Carlsen, Fischer, Kasparov, and you name it. This is a very solid opening that's going to serve you over a lifetime. You can play from beginner to the world champ level. It'll serve you equally good. Also, you secure yourself from any early opening tricks or attacks of your opponent. And finally, after watching this video, hopefully it will be really easy for you to play, because I'm going to give you a complete overview of all the opening moves and common middle game plans. Alright, let's go ahead. So here white goes c4, trying to attack your center, therefore you defend it with your pawn. After that, usually they go knight c3. That doesn't attack anything directly, but anyway, puts a little bit more pressure to your center. Therefore you play a kind of symmetric move, knight f6, defending your center further and just developing your piece. In this position, white usually develops with either knight f3 or bishop g5. That doesn't really matter because they're going to play both moves anyway, ultimately. For example, bishop g5, we play bishop e7 to neutralize this pin and also getting ready to castle. After that, white plays knight f3, we indeed castle kingside. And now usually white goes pawn e3 because they also need to open the diagonal for this bishop. By the way, let's notice that here, so far, you already castled. You know, just within a couple moves of the game. It only took 5 moves for you to castle, which is great, because it means that you secured your king from any early attacks, you put it to safety as quickly as possible. What do you do right now? Well, first of all, before you continue development of your queenside pieces, I do recommend that you include the move pawn h6. It is actually quite a universal recommendation. Whenever your opponent has this bishop on g5, it is almost always a good idea in any opening to play pawn h6, kicking this bishop away. Because if bishop takes here on f6, that's great for you. You're gonna gain the 2 bishops advantage, so this exchange, generally speaking, favors you because bishop is a little bit stronger than a knight, so we don't worry about that. We would appreciate this to happen. And if bishop goes back, then okay, you just played this useful move pawn h6 without any time spent, because you gain a tempo attacking white's bishop. Now your king has an escape path, so that in some future variations you never suffer the bank rank checkmate problem. Also, if it's necessary, you control this square g5, so white can never go there. Therefore, all in all, it's a little bit useful to play this move. Alright, after that, what do you do next? Well, we gotta develop these queenside pieces, which are still completely passive. What do you do about this bishop? It is locked around this diagonal by this pawn, therefore we want to fianchetto with the bishop. So we play pawn b6, known as the Tartakover defense. There are different titles actually. Want to fianchetto the bishop. Because there is pressure between these 2 pawns here, and they are likely to be exchanged down the road, our bishop along this diagonal will be extremely active. So we go pawn b6. Alright, now white is at the crossroad with evergreen Shakespeare's question, to take or not to take. That is the question. We're going to analyze both options and which one to start with. So, they can take here on d5, or they can play bishop d3 and just maintain the tension and try to develop. Amateur players usually do take on d5, although pros usually keep developing pieces. Anyway, let's stick to c takes d5 first, and after that we'll check the other option just as well. Now you're also at the crossroad. You could take with a pawn, but it is better to take with the knight and to initiate some exchanges. There's a general strategic rule which says that when you're lacking space, when your position is a little bit cramped, it is good to trade off some pieces just that you have more free space to maneuver. And so because our position is slightly limited, mostly our pieces are on the last 2 ranks, we would love to initiate some exchanges, and that's why knight takes d5 is good, because we're offering an exchange of these knights, but also we're opening up this diagonal, and therefore white will probably need to do something about that and take here. So I actually trade bishops here. After that, white usually takes here on d5. So we trade a couple pieces, and now you have a lot more open lines, and diagonals all around. Your position becomes free, which is nice. White still needs to develop, so they're going to play bishop to d3, and now you could develop, but I prefer playing c5 and to strike in the center right away. That is actually the second purpose behind your move pawn b6. The first intent was just to fianchetto this bishop over here, but the second intent is that thanks to this pawn on b6, you also support this central advancement c5, which is another standard opening rule to fight for the center. c5. And, well, once again, I can take right now, or I can choose not to. Again, in most cases, amateurs do take here on c5, so let's start with that, which is the most classical line. In this case, we do want to recapture with the pawn. Capturing with the queen would actually be quite a big mistake, because that will leave you with this isolated pawn on d5, and white's knight is getting this great square on d4, which is a long-term, advantage for white. Also, potentially the rook can operate here along the c-file and hit your queen. So white has a lot of positional advantages here, and for that reason, queen takes c5 is actually a pretty huge positional mistake. We instead want to recapture with the pawn, and now our pawns are doing a great job controlling all these central squares. They are hanging pawns, so-called hanging pawns, because they're not defended by other pawns from behind. Because of that, white may try to attack them, but you have a lot of resources to defend them, so that's not a problem. Anyway, those pawns have pros and cons. Pros because they control a lot of squares, they can be pushed forward at some point, and the disadvantage is that white may try to attack them, but it's not a big problem, because if you know how to handle them, you are safe. Alright, white needs to castle. Here there is another really worth remembering idea. When your pawn here on d5 cannot really move, it is better not to put your bishop here to b7. Because if you remember, we discussed it like a few minutes ago, that our initial intent of fianchetto the bishop was the idea that the pawn on d5 will be exchanged at some point, and our bishop would operate along this diagonal. But now if you place it here, you cannot exchange this pawn anymore, because white's pawn on c4 has gone, so you can't take there. And so the bishop is kind of passive here. It can only move one square forward, and it doesn't really attack anything. That's why, in those positions where your pawn from d5 cannot be exchanged, it is better to develop your bishop over here to e6. Here, not only the bishop defends this pawn, but it also controls this diagonal, and therefore it is more active. Okay, what can white do now? Well, let's say rook to c1, put in the rook into the game, potentially taking aim at this pawn. It's not a problem yet because your queen defends it, but anyway, you can play safe and play knight d7. Now your knight also defends this pawn, therefore you have nothing to worry about at all. Okay, what can white do now? In most cases, of course, they can just move their queen or rook around. That doesn't really matter. Sometimes they'll play bishop b1, preparing, this kind of an attack, queen d3 and queen h7. Of course, it's not a big problem. You can defend easily in many different ways. The move that is considered to be the best, I think, here is the move rook f to c8, which may seem slightly mysterious if you don't know the black's plan here. What's the point of rook c8? Well, first of all, you do defend this pawn once again, and it is useful because if white goes queen c2, pushing their idea, then in order to cover that square, you may go knight f6, which puts your knight, in a more advanced position and covers this square. But also notice that your rook is now really useful in defending this pawn, because if not, without this rook, white would simply capture it because the queen is defended. So rook c8 is a good thing to do. You may wonder about black's plan overall. What are you going to do next? Well, you've got the b file, which is a really useful file for your other rook. It can go there and operate along the b file, put pressure on this pawn on b2. Also, if white ever pushes the pawn forward to b3, that is really great, because then you can start pushing the pawn forward along the a file, and now your rook is getting active on its original position. And as you play pawn a5, pawn a4, you're going to attack white's pawns there, and that causes some problems for white. For example, if white plays some move, let's say pawn h3, you do play pawn a4. In many variations, you don't have to worry about sacrificing this pawn temporarily, because this pawn is really weak, along with the a2 pawn, and you can get it back very easily. You can just move your queen somewhere, queen d7, or let's say queen a7 perhaps is stronger, and after that, this pawn is weak, white can't defend it anyway, you're going to capture it. After you capture that pawn on a4, the pawn on a2 also kind of becomes weak. Also, now notice that you have a passer along the c-file, and life is good. Your knight is going to land there. Overall, you're putting pressure. That's how you outplay white player who seemingly plays, casual moves, but doesn't really know what to do, so doesn't really know the correct plan, and you keep attacking on the queen side. Okay, now let's analyze another alternative. We just discussed that white may here at this point, after you pushed your pawn to c5, white may exchange here on c5 and create those hanging pawns. And if you know how to handle them, you just develop properly and you're having a great game. Many of your pawns will avoid this exchange and will simply castle right away, which is strangely enough a kind of an error, because it allows you to play pawn c4 and gain the space advantage on the queen side. Of course, the bishop can go back, and it will, but the problem is now white is kind of lacking space to operate. Now the d-file is closed by this pawn. The c-file is closed by your pawn, therefore, playing rook c1 doesn't make that much sense for white right now. Also, because of your pawn, white can't play queen d3 and try to attack along that diagonal. And all in all, as you can see, it's a little bit uncomfortable for white to operate. You just develop, you play knight c6, the standard move. In most cases, your opponents will try to undermine this annoying pawn. And of course, you do want to keep it there. We do not want to exchange here. That would be a big mistake because we would trade off our main asset, the strong pawn. We just want to keep it there and play pawn b5. This is actually a passed pawn. And right now it may not be that obvious, but later on in the game it can become a dangerous force if you start moving it forward. Now here white plays another common error, the move pawn a4. White hopes to trade off your pawn somehow, but the key is we are not going to exchange. We do want to keep our strong pawns there, and you just push it forward, which makes your position completely dominant by this time. Now these two pawns are really strong, they come together, your pawn is ready to go forward at some point, it'll be a defended passed pawn, which is really strong. If white tries taking here, again, great for you, now your pawns are really free to move forward. I've just checked the database, a lot of players play the move a5, don't ask me why. Maybe they hope to play bishop a4, but that doesn't make much sense because you can play pawn b3 right away, and you can see that your pawns are getting really dangerous right now. Ideally, we'd wish to simply play c3, c2, but right now we can't play c3 right away, that will lose this pawn. So we just need to defend it first, that's why you play rook b8, and after that you really are threatening to play, simply c3, c2 and to win. If necessary, you can also always provide some additional support for these pawns. You can play queen b4, or maybe bishop a6, or bishop e6, and then your pawns are going to move forward, and basically you're actually already having a winning game. Going back a few moves, we're coming to the position where we analyzed what happens if white decides to take here on d5. Then we initiate some exchanges by playing knight to d5, and then we trade off the bishops, we trade off the knights, and overall our position becomes more free. Lots of your opponents will avoid this exchange and will play bishop d3. In that case, you just continue with your main plan, which was bishop b7. White will castle, then you develop your knight, the knight goes here to d7. Playing this to c6 would be pretty bad because that would block your c-pawn from moving forward. Also, that blocks this bishop, it can't really move. That's why knight c6 just breaks the harmony between your army, and we do want this knight to stand there, and ultimately we do want to play pawn c5 after that and counterattack white's center. If white takes here on d5, there is also an important nuance to know. Previously, in those exchanges, sometimes we were recapturing by the pawn, but now we do not want that. Remember, we talked about this theme that we don't want this dull bishop to stand on b7 with the pawn on d5 that can't be traded off, because now this bishop has no prospects. Therefore, we do want to keep this diagonal open for the bishop, ideally, if the bishop stands there. And so we take on d5 with the knight, which keeps us to keep this diagonal open, and also it keeps us to trade off some pieces, once again, leaving more empty space for your other pieces to move around. Now this bishop is attacked, therefore white's going to capture here, we recapture. After that, if white takes here on d5, we recapture with the bishop. Everything's cool. Let's say if they take, you recapture by the bishop, your bishop remains to be very active along these files. In the future, we're also going to play pawn c5 to counterattack white's center. Then you place your rooks to the center of the board, and your position is completely fine. It's about equal. Maybe in this case you even have a slight advantage. Very subtle, of course, but overall it should be about equal. But of course you have no problems. Finally, let's analyze the most principled variation from white's perspective, where white never captures here on d5 but maintains the pressure. Most of your opponents won't ever do this, but you ever encounter a really strong opponent or somebody who simply follows a game of Magnus Carlsen or somebody else, they may maintain the pressure and play queen e2, which is again what pros usually do. In this case, we do play pawn c5. That's part of our main plan to counterattack white in the center. Also, playing c5 potentially gives your rook this open c-file to, get involved into the game. And now again, if white captures, you normally recapture with the knight. And capturing actually helps black, because if they take here, you recapture with the knight is getting active, it attacks this bishop, everything's cool. Let's take it back. If white takes here on d5, as we discussed previously, we do want to keep this diagonal open for the bishop, so we recapture with the knight, and again, everything's cool. So we are now worried about those exchanges. And what if white keeps maintaining the pressure and plays rook f to d1 or rook c1, something like that? There are different ways to go about this position, but one thing you can be a little bit worried about is that this opposition of white's rook and your queen. In the event of some potential exchanges here in the middle of the board, the d-file may become open and this opposition may become unpleasant. So we do want to remove the queen from here. But if you play to c7, that doesn't look very good either, because it can be attacked with the knight, with the bishop from here, maybe with the rook from c1. So queen c7 doesn't look that good. But there is a simple solution, and the solution is the move knight e4. We're initiating this exchange, and as the bishops are traded off, our queen automatically gets to the safe and great square. Also, your knight on e4 is strong, it is defended by the pawn, by the bishop, so we don't have to worry about that. And overall, we're reaching the balanced and about equal position. You're gonna bring your rooks to the middle of the board. If you ever feel uncomfortable about the pressure in the center, you're always free to start, making some exchanges, take here, and you'll simplify the position, and at the very least, you're gonna get an equal game. So that was the complete overview of the Queen's Gambit. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments down below.